This is for you new people. I only have one rule.
Hey gang, this is Dave. Welcome back to the Match Grade Podcast. I've got Matt and Ed with me. The interesting thing came up. We had a little discussion with some other instructors, and it got me thinking about how we apply the gun safety rules in real life. So we're going to talk about what we've started to call rule number 4. You know, the 4 rules are always keep the firing point in safe direction, treat all guns as if they're loaded, keep your finger off the trigger until you're ready to shoot, and then always be sure of your target and what's beyond it. And that rule number 4 got us thinking about how do we apply that and how do we bring that into the construct of concealed carry. You know, as I said, we've got Ed and Matt here. We're going to be talking about this, and let's see where it goes. A word of caution. I know that there are a lot of people out there that you guys are welded to your safety rules. I get it. I'm not proposing rewriting the safety rules. I'm just proposing maybe we should think of them differently and maybe apply them in a slightly different way. But let's see what happens.
I think we should kind of maybe go over what the rules are and how they are conventionally applied, and then let's see what your idea on what a new way to look at them is, or look at one in particular, right?
We're going to be looking at this from a concealed carry perspective, not from a brand new beginner shooter learning safety rules. Is that the direction that we're going with?
That's kind of what I'm thinking. Yes, rule number 4 is applicable no matter where you are, whether you're on the range, whether you're in your home doing dry fire practice, whether you're in the gun store. When we're really talking about it is the number 4 is if you're going to fire a shot, you have to be sure of your target and what's beyond it and what's in front of it for going into the concealed carry world. This is kind of one of those rules that lives in all of the construct, everywhere, range, home, firearm safety, everywhere. Let's see what we can do when we apply it in the real world in concealed carry.
I like it. Let's go for it.
Always be sure of your target, what's beyond it. Other variations. What else do we know? Matt, what have you heard on variations of that rule?
Know your target and what's beyond. That's,
Okay.
the kind of standard.
You know, maybe it's surroundings, right? Ed, what about you? What have you heard?
I would just caveat that with what's beyond it, what's above it, what's to the left, to the right of it. You know, especially in concealed carry, we're talking about areas that might not only be one level, or again, heaven forbid, we generally think down is a safe direction. What about little kids running around, or things that might be below you if you're on the second floor? So, you know, what's beyond, what's around, what's above, what's below, just really being cognizant, you know, of your surroundings, which I would say even rule number 4 should almost be rule number 1 or a predecessor to before, you know, thinking about safety rules. So
there's some interesting discussion that came out of when I started talking to some of the other instructors and some people out there in the world, in the firearms world. They got thinking about it, and they're like, wait a minute. Yeah, that would make sense. You know, if we go with like concealed carry rules, we can apply always keep the firing point in a safe direction and say, well, my gun is going to be pointed in a safe direction until I don't need it there and I need to point it somewhere else. But where is a safe direction in the real world out there? We don't have a clean backstop all the time.
So a safe direction might be, I think, Matt, you mentioned this one time, the safest kind of direction.
For concealed carry, I always look at it as the safest direction you have at the given moment you're in. So it's going to change and it's going to adapt depending on what you find yourself doing.
People always ask me, okay, I'm out in public and something bad happens and there's a guy that's hurting people or trying to hurt me. I meet the legal requirements. This isn't a legal discussion, but let's say the situation meets the legal requirements for the use of deadly physical force on the defender. So now we have a stage set. You, as the defender, decide it's time to draw the gun and start dealing with the threat. Do you think maybe before you draw the gun, you got to know that you're going to be able to follow through with your action?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think people have this view of they're going to draw the gun and then find the threat. You know, maybe you're in a shopping mall. Maybe you're in an area where you hear gunfire. Outdoors, it can reverberate just as much as it can do indoors. What if you're in that mall or in that area and you hear gunshots and you don't know where they are? You start whipping the gun out. Guess what? You're now a target. If you're not sure of your target and where it is and what's going on, why's your gun out?
It really scares me because you run into the nightmare scenario. You hear shots. Maybe you know where the bad guy is. You know, it's probably the area that everybody's running away from. But now you've just drawn your gun without positively identifying your target. Guess who also all of a sudden looks like another guy with a gun? Now you've just made yourself look like a bad guy. And again, in a dynamic situation, there's security on site or, rapid response. They're looking for a guy with a gun. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That gun is not going to come out until I PID'd, and I'm ready and confident, that my target and its surroundings are clear so I can take that shot.
So we're really getting back to situational awareness. Mm-hmm. So it leads right from situational awareness into this new look at the rule is situational awareness. I know what's going on, I identify what's going on, and I react and take care of the problem if I need to.
Let's think of it this way. You go back to Western times and even recent times in the 50s, 60s, and even 70s. You got a lot of these guys, Texas Rangers, some U.S. Marshals. What color hats did they wear when they were the good guy? The white hats. All right, and all the bad guys supposedly wore the black hats. We even saw it in movies, so it translated over to movies. But I've seen real-life pictures of Western lawmen, and they always wore the white hats. There was a code or something. When we decide that we're going to defend somebody's life or our life, we've just put that white hat on, and a whole lot of responsibility just came into play. We can't hurt anybody else other than the guy or girl that's hurting people. We just took responsibility for everybody in the area, and we cannot hurt them whatsoever. So we have to be sure that if we do engage the threat, that is the only thing that we shoot.
And how many people are going to have the confidence or skill set in order to do that? Matt, how many times have you heard armchair critics when they hear of a situation in the news or look at a situation on YouTube and say, that guy in a crowded shopping mall, started popping off shots, I would have been able to hit him. I have my sub 2 second draw on the flat range and I would have been able to engage him, no problem.
Everybody thinks that until it happens to them, or until they even try to practice it on the flat range and they realize it's not as easy as they think. I think you got to put your ego aside and look at what your realistic abilities are and then base what you think you can do on that and not on some overblown idea of what you think you can do. Yeah, good point, Ed. Real good point.
Rule number 4. We got to know our target. We got to know its surroundings. We got to know the backstop. We got to know what's going on in front of it. Even though the target, let's say the target meets the requirement for you to point guns at it and shoot it, it can change in a split second, especially in a concealed carry world. Here's what we're talking about. There's a difference between the gun safety rules, range safety rules, and real life safety rules. Now, I'm not saying that all the rules are different, but there's a different application. There's methodology that changes.
A different way to apply it depending on the context. Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. But they all have the same concept. The layered approach to safety. So this idea has been in my head for quite some time when I hosted Ed Monk last year. He actually, we were talking about things offline, and then during the podcast, it really came because he pushes that. He pushes that rule number 4 thing. It has to be, more important than just a fourth rule or an afterthought. It really came up when we were talking about engaging mass killers or other shooters in public. Okay? So you think about this. Let's lay out the gun safety rules first, guys. From the NRA, we have the 3 main gun safety rules. Always keep the gun pointed in a safe direction. Always keep your finger off the trigger until you're ready to shoot. Always keep the gun unloaded until ready to use. Okay, so those are the 3 NRA cardinal main 3 right there. Here are the basic firearm safety rules from the NSSF. Number 1, always keep the firearm pointed in a safe direction. Number 2, treat all guns as if they're loaded. Number 3, keep your finger off the trigger until you're ready to shoot. And number 4, always be sure of your target and what's beyond it.
Yeah, that seems a lot more applicable to everyday carry.
Now, in our classes, we do alter them a little bit. We talk about treat all guns as if they're loaded, no exceptions. So we're going to treat all guns as if they're loaded. Mm-hmm. Okay? Never point the gun at anything that you're not willing to shoot or destroy. Keep your finger off the trigger unless you are prepared to shoot. And then know your target and its surroundings. So 3 different variations. And they all pretty much mean the same in a way, just different words, right? Now, let's break them down a little bit. When in the context of concealed carry, is it going to be always possible to keep the gun pointed in a safe direction?
What's a safe direction?
This goes into Matt's point about maybe not a safe direction, but the safest direction.
Okay, so safest direction. Depending on where you are, it might be up because you've got a lot of people around you. But what if there's a second floor where you are? That kind of precludes it. Then it might be down. unless you have small children running around you. So you have to put things in context. Okay? It's all going to be situational. It's all going to be situational. But keeping the gun pointed in safe direction always may not be possible. What about number 2? Always keep your finger off the trigger until you're ready to shoot.
Yeah, that's pretty standard. I think that's easy to follow, and really, there's no excuse not to do that. So I think we're good there.
So if we look at all this stuff, like keeping the gun pointed in safe direction, yeah, okay. Treating guns as if they're loaded. There's one safety construct that says all guns are always loaded. I've got a few dozen examples of that in my gun safe at home because they're all unloaded in the safe.
So there's a difference there between treat it as if it's loaded and the gun is loaded.
So let's get into, we kind of covered the first 3, but let's focus on rule 4. That's what we're here to talk about. Know your target and surroundings, or always be sure of your target or what's beyond it.
Just beyond?
Maybe in front of it, maybe next to it, maybe in front of you.
What's happening in your surroundings is probably a better way to phrase that.
Exactly. Know your surroundings, which now goes to our comment about situational awareness, doesn't it? Let's look at a really good example. We had a church shooting a couple years ago. It was Jack Wilson in the church there, and they had a guy come in. He exhibited some disturbing behavior, but it wasn't bad. It was just off. And then all of a sudden, this guy went to guns. He pulled a shotgun out and shot a guy, and then I think he shot another person. And then Jack Wilson, who is approximately about 14 to 17 yards away, drew his gun, right? Drew his gun and put 1 or 2 rounds into the head of the shooter in under 4-point-something seconds.
Yeah, it was like 4.6 seconds from the first shot.
That's pressure. And what else was going on around him, Ed?
There's people screaming, people yelling. There's people probably running to, from. It's a very extremely dynamic environment, but probably what's also happening in Jack's body. I'm guessing his heart rate's jacked up to 100. The blood pressure is going up to 200. We're talking about a lot of blood flow. So being able to make sure that you are confident. And 15 yards, sure, when you're practicing on a flat range, the target's not moving. The target sure as hell isn't shooting back at you. You have all the time in the world in order to take that 2-second draw, sub 2-second draw.
Let's back up a little bit and let's talk about this rule number 4 again, because we just gave a really good example of a background that, wasn't good. The environment was not good. There were people running around. There were people everywhere. There were people behind the shooter as well as next to him and in front of him. And this guy threaded the needle and only hit the bad guy. So that was impressive. That was just off the chart impressive. And I give this guy a lot of credit for having the wherewithal and the mindset and the fortitude to pull this off. I don't know if he'll ever admit that he expected it to work, but he knew he had to do something, and that something was about as perfect as you can guess. And no one should be second guessing this guy. We look at rule number 4. I'm kind of thinking that in some settings, in some situations, rule number 4, knowing your target and what's beyond it, maybe what's in front of it, what's around you, all that stuff, AKA know your surroundings, should kind of overshadow all of the gun safety rules.
Overshadow or come like as the first thing you should be doing. So if we're looking at the rules and we have the last rule, and people get stuck on this as being 1, 2, 3, 4. They have to follow a certain order and do them in a certain order. And the last one is know your target and what's around it or beyond it or whatever version we're looking at. Then that's the thing, like, okay, that's the last thing they're going to be thinking about. But maybe it should be first, like you just said.
As humans, we like to put things in numerical orders for certain reasons, right?
Exactly.
Our minds like to do that. The first thing I do, the second thing I do, the third thing I do. The most important thing is going to be the top of the list or number 1 on my list. Like going grocery shopping, the one thing you want to remember, you're going to write down first.
I would say that for gun safety, when it comes to training and training new shooters, it is important to go in this order.
Right.
Because, perhaps we are on the flat range, just touching on that for a second, we're talking about gun safety and handling gun safety. So training that way, gun comes out, we're trained not to touch it until the instructor tells us to do so. Now we can pick it up. Now we have identified the target, and now we're ready to shoot. It goes in that order to minimize, any type of negligent discharge that might happen. But as we've emphasized, we're taking it out of that kind of box range environment and we're applying it to concealed carry world where I would say with the levels of awareness, this should precede any of the other gun safety rules. We should already be thinking about rule number 4 constantly.
So my thought is, you just mentioned like when we train newer shooters, we introduce rule number 1, discuss it, rule number 2, discuss it, and therefore, there and then on and then on. But what happens is we're building it in a sequence because we want them to remember it in sequence. But in the concealed carry world, as they get used to that sequence and learning those rules to try and ingrain them into their psyche of being a gun person, they have to almost become an amalgam. They have to all work at the same time.
Well, think about this. You go to the range, the gun is cased, we'll say in general, especially for that new shooter. Keeping it pointed in a safe direction becomes important, right? You open that case, where's it pointing? We got to be reassured. That's the first step. It makes sense. Second, like treat it as if it's loaded. So we're going to treat it the same no matter what we're doing with it. Then keep the finger off your trigger. That all makes sense. But in the real world, the gun's already in a holster. That's already pointed in a safe direction, quote unquote.
And hopefully it's loaded.
And hopefully it's already loaded. And your finger's not going to be near the trigger until you draw the gun. But why am I drawing the gun? That's where rule 4 becomes rule 1.
Yeah.
Why am I drawing the gun?
They almost have to change the order based on necessity.
And circumstance, yeah.
Circumstance, yeah. In some of our threat, don't shoot, threat, non-threat, shoot, don't shoot scenarios, we actually give them feedback based on why did you draw the gun and then go search for the threat. Why didn't you wait until you knew where the threat was before you drew the gun while maybe taking cover?
That's it. Don't go running through Walmart with the gun out again.
We've seen that video. How many concealed carriers were drawing guns after they looked at the video in totality from the store?
There was at least 5 that had guns out.
And these were all individuals that probably didn't know each other.
Almost certainly.
How'd you like to be one of those guys and you come around the corner and there's a guy with a gun? You've got a really fast decision to make. Or the other guy's got a really fast decision to make. You better hope both of you make the right one.
Yeah, because all the info you have is shots were fired. And now you got someone with a gun.
Interesting. You said, you got to make a really fast decision. In my head, rule number 4, rule number 4, rule number 4, you're just being aware of your surroundings. That gun doesn't come up until you've PID'd. This threat needs to be taken care of. And then all of a sudden, 1, 2, 3 should happen in very quick succession. It shouldn't be gun comes out. I have to be aware that it's pointed in a safe direction for a long period of time.
Right. Here's another way to apply the safety rules. Treat all guns as if they're loaded. I kind of put that in context of I need to know the status of my gun at all times, whether it's loaded or not, and when should it be loaded or not. But if I'm carrying a gun, I know I've loaded that gun. I don't have to check it every 5 minutes or every hour or every day. I know it's loaded because I loaded it. Nobody else has touched it. The Keebler elves didn't come out and put graham crackers in there or change it. I know it's loaded by just default of I loaded it and nobody else has messed with it. That box is checked off. I know the status of the gun. So I've already gotten that one out of the way. That one can kind of blend into the background a little bit. Another rule of don't put your finger on the trigger until you have a confirmed threat and are ready to engage it. That one can't go into play until rule number 4 comes into play.
Because I have to know there's a threat.
And I got to know that I can shoot it without endangering somebody else, right? So we just reordered the safety rule a little bit based on construct. What's our last one? Safe direction. Yeah. That was one of the other safety rules. I'll submit that in a defensive situation, in an active shooter type situation, whether it's them against you or them against somebody else and you're intervening, I'm going to put it out there that the only safe direction or the best safe direction is going to be the guy doing the shooting.
If you've identified that person.
After you've gotten rule number 4 out of the way.
I think having the confidence to take that shot, Dave, you mentioned it in one of the classes. Who was it that they said, if I can't make that 20, 25 yard shot, they're going to use the confusion and the movement in order to get as close to their target as possible, and if it's still a threat, they're going to screw that muzzle into the temple of the threat and then ensure that it's going to be a positive shot on target.
I know that guy very well. It's me. That is one of my plans that I have in the back of my mind, that if I'm in a crowded area and somebody starts shooting and I can't get out, because that's going to be my first plan, getting out with as many people as I can take with me safely, including my loved ones, probably shoving out the door out of the area in front of me. If there's no other option, I'm going to use the confusion. I'm going to get as close as I can. And my plan is to hopefully be able to screw the muzzle into the side of his head or his eyeball and pull the trigger to guarantee that that's the only person that gets hurt from my gun. And I don't know if I'm going to be able to pull it off, but I'm going to give it one heck of a try.
But the closer you get, the better chances you have of being successful.
Exactly.
Right? So that's the thing. So, yeah, use some tactics, use the confusion, use some cover to give yourself that chance. But you have to know, again, where that threat is, who that threat is, what that threat is doing, and be sure of it. So, again, we're back to making Rule 4, Rule 1. So,
no matter what, you got to make sure that that bullet stops in your target, or at least has a positive stopping point.
So what about if situations change in a dynamic type environment? How important does that become in applying Rule 4? Same situation, we've identified a threat, we are going to engage a target, but all of a sudden, curveball, the threat ducks behind a counter, or somebody walks out of a door from behind the threat, or heaven forbid, the threat grabs somebody and uses them as a human shield. Should we be Rule 4 focused? Gun goes away again. What are we doing?
I would say that the muzzle direction rule might get changed a little bit, like not point the muzzle at that anymore. Well, maybe. Again, there's no absolutes.
but how did we get there? We're still identifying if that's still a threat, where that threat is, yes, and what's around it, what's going on around it.
Yeah.
You know, you said about a hostage. Well, we got to recognize they took a hostage, or someone walked out from that door, or they dropped down behind the counter. Or think about this. If we actually engage the threat and they're going down now, and now they're no longer a threat, do we stop shooting? We have to stop shooting because now our rounds are going to go places we don't want them to go. So, yeah, we're still identifying threats.
We really look at it this way. When we're shooting, we need to find a way to guarantee 100% hits on target. We cannot afford 99% or less. You look at some situations where they've been able to place rounds in a 3-inch square from 15 yards in under 3 to 4 seconds under stress. Not just a timer, but under stress. I don't know a lot of shooters that could probably do that.
The average concealed carrier probably cannot do that.
So we're expecting an outcome that probably quite a few people are incapable of doing. Almost like blending rule number 4 with maybe some concept of what are you actually capable of doing with the safety rules and your gun is going to be important. You know, like the situational awareness doesn't just go with your situation. It goes with what are you capable of in the situation. You know, Ed's point of the target suddenly changed. You know, you have the, you know, we'll call it the green light to engage that target because you've said, okay, this thing is meeting all of the requirements for the use of deadly physical force. I believe I can carry out what I'm intending to do. I think I have the skills. I'm pretty sure I can make this happen. And all of a sudden the target moves down behind the counter. Well, you got to start reevaluating now. When you're using the MAT program or, you know, your Garmin or something and you're navigating and you take a different turn and it starts yelling at you saying recalculating. That's what you got to do.
You're recalculating. Yeah.
So I'm not saying you should say that in your head, but in reality, you have to think, all right, what's my next step? What do I need to do now in order to ensure that the people in this area or just myself are safe? You know, maybe because it ducked, maybe it's time to exit because maybe you're the only one at risk. Okay, time to go. You can deal with it later. You can deal with it on another setting or another situation.
I think that's a really good point to pick up. One other thing is, what if that threat becomes a non-threat? Most shooters are looking for the easy targets, and they're not expecting a concealed carrier to confront them. And I think it's important to emphasize that just because these rules are written in order does not mean you can't stop at step 2 or step 3 if your threat becomes a non-threat. You know,
Exactly.
you have to be able to, rule says, keep your finger off the trigger until you're ready to shoot. Okay, I'm ready to shoot, fingers on the trigger, but just as important, fingers got to come off the trigger when you're not ready to shoot or you're not going to be taking that shot.
You have to be able to be flexible enough to understand that the thing has changed. You know, you might have had the green light to point guns at it and engage it, but in the time frame that it took you to get to your gun and get the gun on target and get ready to shoot and activate that brain cell that says you need to make this happen, that threat has decided it doesn't want to be shot. And now it's not a lethal threat. And you've got to recognize that and be able to de-escalate enough to still keep that threat under control, keep that threat where it's not going to continue at a lower level or re-escalate. You might be thinking, well, the minute the gun comes out, I'm going to send one downrange. And in the middle of your draw stroke, it changes and you still send one downrange. You might have a huge problem to deal with.
Yeah, that could be a real problem.
So again, it goes back to the situational awareness, which we're now, looks like we're encompassing rule number 4 into, making, instead of just being aware of your target, it's being aware of your situation and yourself. Think of it this way. We talk about deadly physical force in the concealed carry world because it's important, because that's the application of the skill that that you're doing. In the end, you're responsible both morally and in some cases legally for every single bullet, every single projectile that leaves your gun. And you're also responsible for what it hits. You cannot argue that. There's no gimmies. There's no oops, sorry. How'd you like to be the guy walking down the street who just left the coffee shop and you get zinged in the buttocks or somewhere else because somebody a block away was shooting at somebody and they didn't mean to hit you, but you still got hit? You're going to have some different thoughts about the day. And I think you're going to be quite ticked off because you got shot by somebody who was just shooting and not guaranteeing that they were going to be as accurate as possible and hit their target.
Even if you're not shot, if I'm a bystander and I just got shot at inadvertently, I mean, there are lots of examples of, unfortunately, police, law enforcement, or just a concealed carrier exchanging fire with a threat or a gunman, somebody like that, and yet nobody got hit, miraculously enough.
Including the bad guy.
Yeah. But those bullets did go somewhere. Whether that was into a vehicle, whether that was into an empty coffee shop, whether that was into a park or a field. I'm not going to be a very happy person, if I was anywhere in that general vicinity. So again, rule 4, more important as ever, because, we hear about situations where so-and-so exchanged 40 shots, 30 shots, and yet nobody got hit, in a crowded location.
Well, we all should understand the realities of defensive firearms encounters. And if you don't, you should research them and you should start understanding them, because that'll give you an idea of what you can expect under stress. If you can reapply and keep applying rule number 4, knowing your target, what's around it, what in your situation, and being situationally aware, even to a small factor under stress, you're probably going to do a lot better than the average. And that's the key. That's the key. Because think of it this way. It is unacceptable to hurt somebody that wasn't trying to hurt you. It's just, you can't do that. We're not supposed to do it. We're good guys. We can't. Bad guys do the spray and pray. We can't. We have to be surgeons with this. We have to be precise.
Both legally and morally, we are responsible for every round. So we have to maintain that awareness all the time.
Wrapping, putting all this nice big bow on the top of all this here. Rule number 4 might, in a lot of cases in concealed carry, be the umbrella rule over the other 3 or over any other safety rules, because you can't point firearms in unsafe directions. You can't put your finger on the trigger until you know that you have a confirmed threat. And you can't engage it unless you absolutely know that your projectile or bullet or whatever you want to call it is going to only affect that target. So maybe rule number 4 is a little more important than most people give it credit for. We've kind of put a lot of info out there, hopefully some thought-provoking stuff. And like I said, I know people are welded to their construct of safety rules because that's how they learned, and I get it. I'm fine. I'm not trying to delete anything. I'm trying to make you think a little more critically. One of the things is like, one of my mentors a few years ago said, conventional wisdom must be questioned at times because you never know if it needs to evolve. So let's, we're going to let this hang a little bit. What kind of final thoughts would you add? And then we'll move on from there.
For me, it's just the idea of that the safety rules as originally written or thought of for most people are great on the flat range, great for learning shooters, learning to shoot. But they may not apply as well in the real world in a real life situation. And pushing that one step further, you also really need to test your skills on the flat range in some realistic type scenarios to see if you have the skills to do what you think you can do. And it all kind of flows together into one process or one thought moving forward about concealed carry. It's a awareness and ability that brings you to dealing with the situation. If you don't have those, then you're not going to be able to deal with the situation you find yourself in.
There's a solution for that. It's called training and education.
That's right.
Right? Ed?
All really good points. And I think when the safety rules came out, they were the best that they could be at that time. You know, when the NRA came out with their big 3 cardinal rules and they emphasized always, I'd like to think that they put always in front of each of their rules just so that people would understand the importance of them, not that they are an absolute when it comes to firearm handling. Like Matt said, a lot of these rules, it's the safest or safer direction, because I would argue in a dynamic changing situation with a real life gun threat, there is no real safe direction, just a safer and safest direction. And the ultimate goal in that situation is to make the situation safest. Putting down an active threat is the only thing that you can do in order to make that situation safer. And as far as training goes, yeah, I really got to say, if the only training that you've done is on a flat range with a target that is not moving, absolutely look up some institutions that allow for force on force, stress-based training, because you'd be amazed at how marksmanship kind of goes out the window. Being able to be confident in your skills and recognizing your shortcomings, truly being honest with yourself, is, I think, going to be paramount in trying to address threats when it comes to these type of Rule 4 situations.
Ed, that's a great point. We all have expectations of what we want to do or hope to do, but we also have to temper that with what are we actually truly capable of doing versus our expectations. Okay? Honestly, we do a lot of good training with stuff. We do some force-on-force stuff. You want to test yourself against a real-life adversary, we'll break out the simunitions or UTMs or even the airsoft guns, and we'll put you in a scenario, and let's see how you do, and let's see what happens. And then you can learn from it. It's not going to be a fail. It's going to be something you can learn from. But you have to test yourself. You have to decide if your expectations have a basis in a realistic outcome. I hate to say it because I know the level of training of most people that carry guns. It's not as high as they want it to be because of a lot of factors. There's life. Life gets in the way. I'm not saying they're slackers, but it's just there's so much that we have to do to maintain our everyday lives. We can't train as much as we want, but we need to train as much as we can. Guys, I'm going to close this out. Thank you for listening. We want to hear your thoughts about rule number 4. Please chime in a little bit and, offer some feedback. Just don't say you guys are wrong, you guys are dumb, you guys are, offer some feedback. This is a discussion, okay? This is a discussion. It's not anything else. But please be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Support us on Patreon, and we'll see you guys in the next one.